Yes. I think we have to start. I'm already 2 minutes late, so I might have to talk faster. Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back into the Melbourne Brain Centre after 3 years in the wilderness because of COVID. Even Freud had to toe the line and abide by local rules. We begin our conference today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri owners and custodians of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We honour the distinctive histories and inspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, and we stand with Indigenous struggles for social justice and empowerment in Australia and globally. It is about us all working towards the future together, thinking about the stepping stones to exercise our own responsibility and each other as one nation. Now, before we start our proceedings, just a couple of notices. Readings will be here once again from morning tea. Please do not bring food and drink into the auditorium. I think we have to sort of keep everything as we see it or receive it. At the end of the day, feel free to remain between 5 to 6 p.m. to finish off the day with well-earned drinks and finger food. And if anyone's got any queries, there are 2 Melbourne Brain Centre staff to assist. There's T and Millie, who have come today to just help out at any stage. So I now hand over to Tim Keogh.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's really a great honour and a privilege to have been asked to participate in what I think is such a fundamentally important conference for all of us to participate in today. Once again, just to acknowledge that we do meet on Wurundjeri land to commemorate the contribution of Freud, who provided us with the gem of psychoanalysis. Today in particular, we're going to examine how psychoanalytic listening that he originally described can strengthen the Indigenous voice or Indigenous voices. And this reminds me actually of Freud's prediction that the ultimate value of psychoanalysis will probably lie outside the consulting room. In making this prediction, he was foreshadowing the many potential applications of psychoanalytic theory, especially to complex social issues like those which we'll focus on today. I think issues that many of us feel very passionate about. In terms of that, I'd like to start out by congratulating the organising committee, and in particular its long-standing chair, Chris Hill, and express my sincere thanks for other speakers for their willingness for doing what Freud had envisioned we could do with psychoanalysis. In a year when Australians will be asked to express their view via a referendum about Indigenous Australians having a voice in the Constitution, this conference wishes to provide a public space where we, as psychoanalytically oriented therapists, and indeed others interested in the intersection between psychoanalysis and Indigenous issues, can understand how such issues can be voiced and how psychoanalytic listening might be able to facilitate this. In introducing today's conference, I was also reminded optimistically that in 1967, there was an important referendum conducted to make changes to Australia's constitution. In particular, it was a vote to change the constitution to allow Indigenous Australians to actually be counted in the census as people. And an important step that paved the way for future rights that could be acknowledged. What I think is so optimistic, reflecting back on that, was the vote was overwhelmingly in favour of a constitutional change, with over 90% of people voting with a yes. and it became one of the most successful national campaigns for Indigenous rights. It was a huge victory which showed the changing mindset of non-Indigenous Australia. In assisting the empowerment of Indigenous voices, I believe as psychotherapists and psychoanalysts today, we're well placed, especially in terms of our ability to understand the impacts and effects of intergenerational psychic pain for Indigenous Australians that has been contingent on the colonial invasion and the complete decimation of a culture whose impact continues to be manifested both in individuals and communities. I think we're also well placed to understand how continuing systemic influences maintain disadvantages that add to the ongoing pain and difficulties of Indigenous Australians. One of the things that's quite important, of course, though, is as Indigenous, non-Indigenous people, in order to understand such issues, the best place to put ourselves in is that of listening, and not in an arrogant position of knowing. All of this is so important because there are still so many issues that do need to be voiced. For so long, there has been no voice and very few people listening. The statement from the heart in 2017 gave us a moving distillation from Indigenous Australians of what needs to be voiced, and a statement that perhaps only a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution can achieve. The statement voiced the structural nature of the problem by noting, quote, "This is the torment of our powerlessness, but with substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood." This is perhaps the rationale for why an Indigenous voice does need to be enshrined in the Constitution. Otherwise, it might be that systemic factors fostering disadvantage will continue. In this regard, once again, it's a sobering and tragic reminder of the lack of listening that Indigenous Australians were not counted until 1967. A more recent and ongoing reminder is the difficulty with the closing the gap social disadvantage indicators. These are 17 indicators measured by the Productivity Commission, which we continue to make poor progress with overall. The objective of the national agreement was to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and governments to work together to overcome the inequality they experience and achieve equal life outcomes. The Australian government adopted the goals in 2008 with a focus on meeting targets aimed to close the gap in areas such as health, infant mortality, education, and employment outcomes. As I said, only slow and less than optimal progress has been made since the inception. In 2020, it was acknowledged that things were not working so well within the Closing the Gap framework, and the strategy was significantly overhauled with new targets identified. Nonetheless, the Productivity Commission in 2022 suggested there were some targets that were on track and improving. A couple of examples: Indigenous babies born with a healthy birth weight now at 89%, and Indigenous children enrolled in preschool now at 97%. Whilst this represents some progress in important areas, it's important to note that other areas are not doing quite so well. There's still high rates of suicide amongst Indigenous people. Indigenous people, both adults and juveniles, are still disproportionately represented. In Northern Territory, I believe 90% of all juveniles detained are Indigenous. These indicators reflect the ongoing interplay between disruption and dislocation and its relationship to ongoing systemic discrimination. With this relatively poor track record in mind, we can see the importance of the enshrined voice in the Constitution. But today we're particularly wanting to look if our way of listening, psychoanalytic way of listening, can facilitate and strengthen the voice. Psychoanalytic listening is characterized by a focus on both conscious and unconscious aspects of what is being communicated. In a real sense, it's about listening to pain and trauma. It privileges unconscious aspects of communication, which help us locate pain and the defenses against us. And the vehicle of symbolism and metaphor, of course, common to psychoanalysis and indigenous culture. Transformation of such psychic pain is thus seen to be contingent on accessing and working with this dimension of communication. In the consulting room, the patient is helped to become aware of their pain and is assisted by being able to mentalize or think about it. In doing so, the patient can be released from the restrictions that it places on their emotional life while it remains unmentalized. Salman Akhtar, in his recent book, Psychoanalytic Listening, provides us with a new and substantial understanding of this concept. He describes different types of listening, including listening objectively, subjectively, empathically, and within an intersubjective framework. He notes that all of these have what he calls maternal or paternal qualities and suggests that effective listening requires a blend of the two. He also notes the important role of the analyst's subjectivity in the listening process and the importance of being able to use judiciously one's countertransference. If employed carefully, psychoanalytic listening can also be applied at a group level where it can help to mentalize intergenerational trauma. And also politically, it can assist in informing policy. Important to this conference, in considering impediments to psychoanalytic listening, Akhtar also highlights marked socio-cultural differences between analyst, patient, or group. In this regard, and in today's enterprise, we thus need to be guided in our understanding of what San Roque has described as intercultural transference and countertransference. Understanding intercultural issues is essential to our ability to listen. The concept, for example, of cultural time and sorry business are good examples and so important, as we shall hear, to our ability to listen to deeper issues, exemplified, for example, by the Kumanjari Walker inquest hearings. The sessions that follow will hopefully be helpful to us in understanding such issues, that in again, with reference to the statement from the heart, we can move towards a place where it's possible for all Australians to, quote, empower our people and take a rightful place in our country. When we have the power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They'll walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to the country. In the first session today, Pamela Nathan will seek to open up the story on the youth crisis in Central Australia by drawing on the psychoanalytic work of the organisation that she's laboured long and hard with, Cassie, creating a safe, supportive environment. And we'll talk about the voices of youth who are suffering the brutal legacies of colonisation. She'll also touch on what has been referred to as soul murder, the deathly crisis of wounded psyches that may be transformed into soul making on ancestral lands, awakening sacred selves. She'll also suggest how giving voice to the Aboriginal people, the ancestors, the fathers and uncles, can empower the youth to have their voices heard, their legacies understood, and foster their authentic journeys, the inviolate homeland of the sacred, thereby catalysing soul murder into soul making. In another highly moving personal account, San Roque, in our second session this morning, will acknowledge how the presence of Indigenous voices has been part of his experience since the age of 4, part of his experience growing up in a New South Wales country town on the Lachlan River. And he'll talk about how, following his training and work as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in London, he began to apply his training experience in Australia, especially amongst the Indigenous people of Central Australia. In his presentation, he will recount some highly impressive and specific experiences. He'll highlight the importance and value of careful psychoanalytic receptive attention, attunement to symbolic communication, and attunement to unconscious processes, and importantly, the play and interplay of ontologies that are not our own. In the afternoon panel session chaired by Eve Steele, 3 speakers, Ken Leckleitner Pangata, Chris Croker and Melinda Hickson will join with Pamela and Craig and myself to draw attention to intercultural responsibility, accountability and uses of culture and law. And this will be followed by an open forum chaired by Rob Gordon to discuss all the presentations. So I hope you'll find the day rewarding and memorable as we together work on this very human project. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce.
You had to round the wrong way. I first, and second.
Okay, all right. Not according to.
I don't mind deferring, but actually I'm up first.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to introduce Craig,
Yeah.
who's already introduced himself. Yes, I did misspeak there. I think everybody knows Craig pretty well, but he's based in Alice Springs. He's worked with indigenous communities for a long time. He's very accepted in those communities and has managed to engage with intercultural transference pretty well, I think. This is one of his major achievements. He's a psychotherapist with 30 years experience in Aboriginal environments of health law, youth and indigenous healer initiatives. And he's especially interested, as I say, how complex subcultural assumptions influence Black and white relations. And we're really very grateful to have you with us this morning, Craig. So thank you.
This is a map of the country taken from outer space, just to orient us to primarily central Australia, because that's where much of the work and the experiences that we speak to today, where that has come from. Ken Leckleitner, who I've known and worked with since 1995, and Pamela and her extensive experience in the Western section with Ken Leckleitner's father, Japananka Leckleitner, and Melinda, who is closely related to many of the people that I will bring to you today, in particular, Jungarai Spencer, Larry Jungarai Spencer. And so somehow or other, we are a kind of a mongrel family, Black and white. And I hope Australia becomes much more of a mongrel nation, honouring our interrelationships rather than any pure streams which no longer exist, really. So here's the map. And if you look, obviously, toward the central desert part, that's where we speak from. And a little further, if I get this right, this is the familiar map, the language map, and it's primarily Amajara, Warlpiri, across through the Piddibi area down to the Aranda region, with a little flick now and then toward the NPY, the Nganjara, Yangatjara, Pitjantjara lands in the central section. That is the area that we have our ground upon for this talk for you today. There's a Tedeschi truck band song. It's called Midnight in Harlem. And there's a line in it. I went down to the river. There were old man's shoes on the ground. And those of us who walk through Alice Springs and go down to the river find many shoes and thongs and prams and clothes and the remnants of generations down at the river. So that's where I wish I could play it to you, but the first time I heard Aboriginal voices was 1947. I was 4. My mother had come to live in this small New South Wales country town of Condobolin on the Lachlan River, Wiradjuri country. My original father had got lost in the war. My mother said she didn't know where he was. I have no memory of him. My new father was the doctor, Charlie Arnold. We moved into his house in Condo. There was a white fence with 2 gates. One gate for the family, the other had a brass plate, physician and surgeon. It took me years to work out what that meant. The townspeople, the white women, they would wait for the doc on the veranda, where the men would sit and smoke and wait. And dark-skinned women and kids would sit on the front lawn, waiting to see the doc. They'd talk quietly. And on that day of my memory, looking curiously at me, for I must have just arrived with my mother from the West. I can still hear their voices. Sometimes the doc, my dad then, took me in his car on his rounds, visiting patients around town, and then out to the Aboriginal reserve outside of town. Corrugated iron shacks, hessian bags for doors and windows, dark shadows moving inside. And then my dad says, we'll go and see Mrs. Goolagong. We drive over to the mission houses on the Goobang Creek. I remember old Mrs. Elizabeth Goolagong, her chair, her veranda, smiling then with such care at the doc's new son, who had come from somewhere and nobody knew why, with the doc's new wife. Mrs. Goolagong is of the grandmother generation for Yvonne Goolagong. Same family, same line. In 1967, my wife, Georgina, and I took a ship to Europe. In 1973, I began voyages upon the analytic couch in London, Belsize Park, Mecca of psychoanalysis. You want to know what the sacred sites are for this mob, Kenny? Belsize Park. And do you know, in all that time in analysis, first with the Kleinian and then with the Jungian, and I respect both of them, I never, ever spoke of those Wiradjuri women's voices that I heard on the lawn when I was 4. In 1967 to 1976, my uncle, Barry Dexter, and my wife's father, W.C. Wentworth, along with Charlie Perkins and a few others, were intimately involved in laying the foundations of the recognition referendum 67. And then the Council for Aboriginal Affairs. And then the Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Indigenous affairs are part of my and perhaps your family lines. in one way or another. In 1987, my family returned to Sydney, and one of those daughters is in this room now, and she might remember that perhaps traumatic return from the cool, soft, gentle light of England to the brash signage of Sydney. In 1992, I moved unexpectedly to Alice Springs, and there, quite naturally, men and women, Pintupi, Warlpiri, Aranda, came to sit in our yard. And so the tradition from my father or stepfather continues, Ken. That's how come you'd always find those Pintupi mob out the back. Mixing in among Aboriginal voices is a normal human matter for some of us. For Melinda, for Ken, for Pamela, and Chris Crocker. And my talk is preparing the ground for them. But now I'll take you to Freud on the couch in Alice Springs. I don't know where he came from. That's me. Let's try it. There. This is the painting which many of you will see again and will have seen before, and I'll keep showing this till the day I die. This is a painting by Rod Moss. It's a friend, associate of his, Patrick Hayes, from out near Whitegate, Alice Springs, and the other model is Howard Goldenberg, a Jewish remote area doctor. This, the interpretation of dreams, as Rod calls it, is my enigmatic icon for this lecture. I might tell you, I even brought a Cuban cigar in honor of Dr. Freud, which if anyone smokes, they can have it after. Now, this picture is here to begin what I'm going to call a parallel process. As you look at the pictures and as you hear me talk, some of it will, I hope, invoke a parallel process. And this begins now. Imagine yourself on the couch with Patrick Hayes, or perhaps in the chair, someone else like Dick Leitner's father, who was close with Pam, and perhaps shook his head many times at her behaviors back in the olden days when you were as young as I was. But think, if you were on the couch and you were telling your dream, and your analyst was in fact a Patrick Hayes, a Warlpiri man, a Warlpiri woman, a Madjura, listening, attending, following the play of your inner life and outer life, I wonder what dreams would emerge, what stories, what listening, what understandings. By implication, hanging on the wall there, as it did in fact hang on the wall of Dr. Arnold's surgery in Condobolin, there's a version of the Hippocratic Oath. An extract of it goes like this. I swear by Apollo the physician and Asclepius that according to my ability and judgment, I will follow that system of discipline according to my ability and judgment that I consider to be for the benefit of my patients, and I shall abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous. And into whatever houses I enter, I will go into them for the benefit of the sick, and I will abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption. I sometimes wish that our political masters or assistants, or the ones we vote for, would have a similar Hippocratic Oath. I remember my father actually reading this to me in Latin. I couldn't follow it, but I liked the sound of it. And Hippocrates, as the Greek practitioner, had an ethic based upon a very old foundation. That foundation nestles in the presence of the Greek eunomia, a creation being, Kenny, a Grecian creation being whose task it is to take core care of good order, eunomia. You, the Greek for good, nomia, law. In a society governed by eunomia, there is a strong sense of community and shared value. And in Central Australia, such order is maintained and has been maintained by Jukurrpa, Altura, held together by the forces of cultural law and specific forms of social governance about which we will speak today. You'll hear more of that from Angata Nekleiter. The eunomia of a society or an ecosystem or a body or a mind refers to, as I understand it, good enough working together of the constitutional elements of people, kin, economy, creature, and country, so that a functional unity or inner consistency is there of a whole system. And the oppositional force against eunomia is, of course, dysnomia or anomie. A society falling into the claws of dysnomia becomes a society of oppositional defiance. Words of truth become words of the people, become engaged and enraged with self-interest and anxiety, and lies are told as truths. Sometimes it seems to me that we have entered in this country since 1967 into dysnomia. Solon, the Greek, 2,700 or so years ago, was one of those who resisted the autocracies of that time and contributed toward the development of democracy. He speaks eloquently on the value of eunomia in a society. And as a psychotherapeutic practitioner, I say before you all, my ground is also held in the hands of eunomia, the good order of the body, the psyche, the social and emotional well-being of the country itself. And all five of us today will take up threads along these lines. And it's my understanding from many Indigenous men and women that the foundations of this country, this Indigenous country's governance, leads me to conclude that Warlpiri Japaljarri self-governance in particular is a form of authentically measured democracy, preceding the inspiration of Solon and the Greeks. And it is far more fluid and functional than the two-part oppositional system now so current in Australia, in our parliament, and it seems to me in the practices of our courts. I might ask my legal consultant, my daughter Mara, later to speak to such a matter. And now I'm imagining today, in parallel process, in that room in Alice Springs, Patrick Hayes and Dr. Goldenberg, in their own ways, are speaking together, bringing each other their dreams, their psychic constellations, their family histories, their traumas. Goldenberg, of course, is Jewish and came to Australia, along with another family friend of mine many years ago. the movement of the unconscious symbolic forms emerging from these two men and all they represent, emerging into the hard light of our present day. Now here's a little map. This map, I really sort of follow the method with these maps of the sound drawings from people such as Marlene Nampijinpa, Ross, Andrew Spencer, Larry Jungarai. You kind of draw the story you want to tell in the ground, and then you can make up anything you want from it, so long as you've got the drawing there. Well, I won't make it all too much, but this is a map that shows you where I'm going today. Up the top is the personal lines. It begins with number 1 and the little boy, that's me. And he follows a track. He meets a series of mainly Warlpiri Japaljarri men. Number 2, you'll see that picture. Number 3, he sits down with Larry Jungarai Spencer and another man, a doctor, 2 doctors, me and him. By then I wasn't a doctor, I hadn't done my PhD. And we have a story. The story is about snakebite, and I'll tell you the snakebite story. Then the next story is the story of Jungarai Wanu, 2 snakes, a double snake story. And those snake stories are follow, not because it's my intention, because those are the dream snake stories I heard from those men. And as I look back on them now, they follow a very peculiar, particular underground line through my entire life. The central panel starts with good order, homage to eunomia. It picks up Psyche there, sitting on the couch. That's the Greek term, the Greek squiggle there, again is for Psyche, that little hook with the line going through it. The ethics of psychoanalysis. The next line is eunomia restated, the E, eunomia restated, central to the whole thing. And then we get into trouble. There are 2 messed up drawings there, I'll explain later. Down the bottom, there's a rough sketch of Japaljarri Spencer's painting called White Table, Black Fire. His image of the movement toward true intercultural governance, which you'll see. The second is a hint there for Mr. Leckleitner, really, the Kirida and Kurungulu system of managing law between men and women, and the maintenance of good order of this society. Kirida Kurungulu system. The next line, those 3 downward stripes represent the demise, the fall, not of the Roman Empire, but of the Warlpiri Youth Aboriginal Corporation, about which I will speak. And the final is the night in Yuendamu, the Common J. Walker event to which Melinda will also speak. And underneath that is the pattern and the future for the young people of Central Australia, to which Pamela will speak. Next. We're at Mount Theo. That's the whitefellow word. I think it means Mount God, actually, doesn't it? Theo, Theos. Don't know why they call Mount Theo Mount God, but there it is. It might be a reference to Wapata, but there is a Jukurrpa there that concerns the behavior of some lizards, which it's not for me to speak. But I'm just reminding you that even though it's called Mount God or Mount Theo, that whole country is maintained under the Kira Kurungulu, that is 2 groups of men, 2 groups of women who manage together the Jukurrpa for the Mount Theo area, which looks after these young people. And here you have a picture of some of the men, I think it was 2010, at a gathering where some of the senior men have gone out to Mount Theo and taken with them all the young white workers. Well, not all young. I'm there actually in the back somewhere. This was to teach, to hear, to speak, to reflect upon the Jukurrpa of the Mount Theo area and its relevance to the care of young men in particular. And all the white men you see there are well, they're referred to mostly as youth workers, but this is a hard-bitten, but also somewhat idealistic group of young men who've given years of their life to work together with the Warlpiri members of the Mount Theo program, the Warlpiri Youth Aboriginal Development Corporation. It was maybe a 4 or 5 day camp. But I know all those young men, and some of them I still continue as a kind of supervisor for them. The work is no picnic. There is very little sweet talk. There were very few starry eyes, not for long anyway, among those young white men there. And all of them had a robust mutual engagement on the ground together with every single one of the Warlpiri Jamajara men you see there. All of whom move and work during that period with a slow gravity, with keeping wits and good humor about you through the worst of times and the best of times, always following the initiative and directions of the senior men and women who were involved, whose names I will now mention to you, some of whose names. Now, you will know that there is a custom in indigenous cultures where the names of the recently departed are not spoken, and sometimes the faces and the photographs are not shown. But some of us, black and white, also feel nowadays that unless the names of those people who held the country together, unless those names are remembered and spoken of and honoured and acknowledged, then this current generation will forget what came before. And so I mentioned Peggy, Nampi Jimpa Brown. You know them, don't you? Peggy. Jilly, Nakamara Spencer, who took care of my daughters when they were children. Jeannie, Nampi Jimpa Rice, who was one of the major advocates for the teaching of Warlpiri language in the Warlpiri area, in the school in Yuendamu, until by some strange sleight of hand, the Northern Territory Department of Education removed the teaching of Warlpiri from the curriculum. Some of these matters, perhaps Melinda will take up. Maisie Wayne, who works so closely as a mental health worker with her husband, with the remote area mental health team. Lottie Robertson, partner and wife of Eddie Jampi Jimpa Robertson, who again figures very much in the Common Walker story. Japanati Croc Johnson, mental health worker. Darby Jampi Jimpa Ross. Darby said, "You fellas, do you know why God sent the Baptist missionaries to Yuendamu?" "No, Darby, why?" He said, "Because Wapata, that's God, the Father, Wapata couldn't speak Warlpiri. And he said, I really need to speak Warlpiri." So he sent those Baptist missionaries to Yuendamu to learn Warlpiri. And then everybody could pray in Warlpiri and God could listen, and he learned the proper language of the Warlpiri. True story. Harry Jackamara Nelson. persistent, constant, supporting the anthropologists, the linguists, maintaining cultural order at the same time as having a great love of the green can. But he managed. And his eyes were everywhere. Thomas Jungala Rice, about whom I will speak soon. Japananga granites, one of whom, Robin, is maintaining still, as much as he can, the consistency of the support for the coronial inquiry being carried out in Alice Springs, which again, Melinda is aware of. And then I must speak to Larry Jungarai Spencer, in whose line I must count myself. The first time a dreaming story, a Warlpiri Jukurrpa, entered my body properly was in 1991 here in the camp of Larry Jungarai. Japaljarri Spencer took psychiatrist Dr. Leon Pechkovsky, who some of you will know, and I to be introduced to the traditional healer's story of the Jungarai Wanu Jukurrpa. It's particularly relevant for Jungarai, for the Jungarai Japaljarri family group with a Kirita and a Kurungulu system. It's a doctor's story. Now, there were many preceding events to meeting this and many succeeding events, but I just want to bring to you this moment of a meeting with other ontologies. Sitting there with Jungarai, I then began my apprenticeship of listening with receptive attention to the movement of symbolic forms in a language I did not speak, an iconography I had yet to learn, cultivating thanks to a psychoanalytic discipline upon the couch and in supervision with some very good people, and thanks to my memory and my attention to movement in my body's intuitive underbelly, and thanks to my capacity for a kind of internal surveillance of unconscious intensities arising, and thanks also for being alert to the play of ontologies differing to mine, without judgment, listening, and with the practice of quiet. Now, Leon and I followed Larry Jungarai's story of the travels of a Ngangkari snake. Ngangkari meaning traditional healers. It's like the internal form of the training and practice of being a traditional healer. We followed Larry's story of the travels of this snake, his ventures, his troubles, his dismemberment, his gathering into spirit form, his submergence into a water source at Ninmi, Pindabi area, his resting, his waiting. And all of this was spoken and drawn in traveling lines across the country, beginning first on that piece of paper with a blue texter, and then later on the ground, translated as necessary by Japaljarri Spencer. And I took in this story as one might take in the movements of a dream, told on the slow couch of psychoanalytic timelessness. Fragments, glimpses, gnawing at comprehension, receptive attention, clarifying, inquiring, never foreclosing on any interpretation, and being bitten. Yes, bitten. And I came then into the beginning of a new practice of receptivity to symbolic language. Receptive patients, the patients needed to listen beneath the surface to the flow of Warlpiri ontology. Here's a painting done later of that snake, which some of you will have seen before. And I hope you see it again and again. When Larry finished telling as much as he wanted to tell in language and some English, he said, standing up, letting us go, walking with us to the Land Cruiser, he said, you know, Jungarai, that old snake in the beginning, he made everything. And after a while, still standing at the door of the Land Cruiser, I said, Jungarai, and who made you? And Larry, smiling, touched me on the arm and he said, me. I'm him. That's me. Jungarai, I'm him. And after that, Dr. Leon and I went a lot further with that story in the company of Larry's kinson, Japaljarri Spencer, who painted this painting on governance. How am I doing for time? Too bad. Now, allegedly, this painting was made or sent to Paul Keating when he came to power as Prime Minister, as advice to him on how perhaps better governance between black and white could take place. I won't go into the detail. I want to get to the main points, but you'll soon see it pretty quickly. From Japaljarri's point of view, most of Australian governance was conducted at a white table by white men and women with white pieces of paper in front of them, with a cloud around so you blackfellas could never see what was going on inside. You got that across that side? You see the clouds, you see the paper on the table, you see the horseshoe shapes, which is representation of people in the iconography, the Warlpiri iconography. It's a reference to the imprint that a human being makes, bums on the sand. The central panel is his view of how most business was conducted. The decisions were made at the white table, behind the white cloud on the white paper, and then distributed from the table by white men mostly in those days, 1991, with the pieces of paper that were taken into the Aboriginal communities and inserted mostly on the ground in the middle. There was very little Kira Kulungulu receptivity negotiation there, according to Andrew's view. You see how he's intentionally placed the white carrier of the message into the center of the meeting. The next one is closer to the voice, and this was 1991. So what's happening there? What's happening there is, seated on the ground in the center, you'll see 4 black painted figures, bums and sand, 2 white and 2 brown. There, in the center, there is an indigenous painting representing culture Jukurrpa that's specific to the matter, and the paper. So the white paper, and the iconography, the governance iconography, are both on the ground together. And they're surrounded by 4 indigenous, the black, all of whom have come from their 4 communities. That is to say, let's imagine, Ngurrpi, Yuendamu, Kinto, and Kibikora, say. speaking their own languages from their own country and all present representatives. And the two brown figures represent two things. Some say sometimes it's the people who are of both indigenous and non-indigenous descent, the brown people, that is, those with two cultures, and some say those who are able to speak and translate freely between the two languages. Those are you've heard of this term called the First Peoples. That other group are what I call the Second Peoples. Those who are closely related to the First Peoples, understand the system, can probably speak the language, and are able to interpret back and forth between the two cultures. Many of us are probably third, fourth, or fifth peoples. The fifth peoples, in my kind of peculiar mind, are the fifth column, the group of Australians who are intent on disrupting eunomia. So there you see Japaljarri's model, based on the thoughts, no doubt, of many other men and women. Is it possible for us to have on the ground this kind of arrangement? Both cultures with their equal or fair representation and good translators and good negotiators, not men and women only from the white table. Now I think I'll just leave that up for you to contemplate while I read you a story, a brief account from the former CEO of the Yuendamu-based Warlpiri Youth Development Aboriginal Corporation, Susie Lowe. This is personal from her. This is not for publication, but it'll give you an idea of the foundations that still exist if we were ever to proceed to some kind of mutual governance according to the truly democratic method. When the Commonwealth Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Act was introduced in 2006, it allowed only for 12 directors of Aboriginal corporations, but we had over 200 members and 70 directors. The White Act directors laughed at this silly new rule. This silly new rule did not take into recognition the Kira Kurungulu system. That is the need of representatives to be there to manage each other. We subsequently sought an amendment from ORIC and reduced our directors to 50. This was a good compromise. And anyway, all the previous directors kept coming to the meetings anyway. During my 12 years as CEO, we routinely had at least 30 directors at every meeting and never needed to postpone due to the lack of a quorum. Our meetings were open to all community members to ensure transparency and accountability, and we didn't have any secrets. Our meetings were chaired by one or two chairpersons and the then CEO, Eddie Jampijimpa, and Lottie Napangadi Robertson, a husband and wife team, as chairperson. Both led the board with strength and dedication. Now I, says Susie, am called Ngangala, and as such, Eddie and Lottie's daughter, and they took their parenting role of me as CEO very seriously. And in the board meetings, I always covered all the requirements for the members, and all the discussion was in English with translation. And the chairpersons always led the discussion in Warlpiri, and the Warlpiri discussions were long and lively, with views that everyone listened to and considered, and often very loudly and vigorously. Clarifications were finally referred to me in English. Ultimately, a decision was made and conveyed to the whole meeting, with a summary of the debate that had taken place. It was my role then as CEO to follow the board's directions. Now, this is during the period from about 1995 to 2010 to about 2015. This was an extremely strong, effective example of indigenous, non-indigenous reciprocal governance. But it didn't take me long to notice that there was one old man who was the one routinely announcing the decision, Jungler Thomas Rice. He was a tall, elderly, traditional man, long white hair and a beard, and he was never seen without his cowboy hat. He was known as a strong and wise lawman and respected. He was also a founder. But Jungler was the main Kurungulu and his guardian for the Mount Theo outstation, a position of honour and responsibility. And it's interesting to note that his wife, Napijippa Egan, was the first fully trained Aboriginal teacher in Yuendamu. Over the years, I developed a trust with the information that whatever Jungler decided, after having listened to everybody, would be what we would do. But the board was, of course, full of wise old men and women, but there was a particular form of deference to Jungler due to his role as Kurungulu. The concept that Aboriginal men and women currently produced, that is that Aboriginal men and women in Central Australia cannot manage their own affairs. This judgment is offensive and simply not validated by my years within that Aboriginal corporation. There are many people of the calibre of Jungler Rice with knowledge, authority and effective responsibility to make decisions. If I had felt at any time that it was incumbent upon me to make decisions for the mob, it would have been not only impossible, but unwise. I or any other non-Indigenous person would not be competent to do so. I'm reminding us that Melinda, Kenny, Pamela, because we've also seen the gradual disintegration of this system in many Aboriginal corporations in Central Australia. Mostly by a CEO who is hungry for money, reduces the number of board members in Yuendamu, locked the doors, would allow into only selected board members, would often write the minutes him or herself and issue the decisions. Is it any wonder that a certain degree of ennui, couldn't care less, developed in Yuendamu during the time you've observed it? Now I have to tell you a snakebite song. How's my time? 10 o'clock. Am I all right? 7. That's good. That's good. That's all I need. One night by the fire, Dr. Leon and I, with Japaljarri Spencer, he was telling us about how he got bitten by a snake and nearly died. He said his father was either Jungarai, that Jungarai, or another Jungarai, Jimmy, sang to him a Warlpiri song against snakebite. Song and song and song. And someone else had called the flying doctor service and the flying doctor was coming. But before the flying doctor arrived, Japaljarri was dead. So he said. They put him on the plane and then suddenly Japaljarri sat up in the RFDS plane, vomited and was alive. And everyone said, "You're supposed to be dead, Japaljarri. What is this?" And then after a while he said, "Because my father sang to me the song against snakebite and I could hear it in my head all the time." Some years later, I found in Strelo's book, Songs of Central Australia, a reference to a Warlpiri song against snakebite. I think this might be it. Kenny, I'm not sure, but I think this is probably the one. This is the translation into English. May the serpent turn back its coils. May the serpent turn back and its coils be utterly broken. May the serpent's coils be shivered to pieces. May the serpent's coils be cast out utterly. May the backbone of the serpent be smashed into pieces. And it's a long, long song that goes in that sort of repetition in Warlpiri. And Strelo then comments, I'm following now, that's me. I'm still following this parallel process. I'm remembering this song again, almost 30 years later, and I'm thinking of it in the present time. The venom is understood to ascend through the body from the wound to the ear, and there the person loses balance and becomes unconscious. And the invisible snake inside his body then constricts and chills around the throat so that breathing becomes labored and he is choked. The song, however, bids the snake to turn back its progress from the ear, and it commands the coils and the backbone to descend and to be broken into pieces so that the snake cannot choke its victim to death. And as I remember Japaljarri by the fire, telling of his survival from choking, I'm thinking of some of our efforts in this country to choke the voice. And may we turn back the choking. In 2014, knowing that he also was now on his way toward his death, Andrew Spencer painted this painting. It's his version or his diagnosis, really, of the situation. And I'll bring it as clearly as I can to you. The black snake is this internalized healing snake that a Ngangkari or traditional doctor carries. It is emblematic of the therapeutic capacities of a healer or a doctor. My guess is that each psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, doctor in this room and others who take part in therapeutic activity carries within you also a kind of Ngangkari snake, some sort of symbolic way that you represent your capacity to attend, to heal, to be useful. The red snake has become large. This is the poisonous liru. Liru, in this case, not the Ngangkari Wanu, but a liru, poison-carrying snake. And this poison-carrying snake has entered into the body of the Central Australian country that Japaljarri knows of. And if we look carefully, which I'll point to two of them for you, what he's presenting there is a picture of a taxon linking. There's a procession of the disintegration of the connectivity of the people, their situations. So if you go to the head of the red liru, you'll see that he's looking into a group of 5 people. Sorry, mate, 5 people. And instead of the 5 being gathered into a form of good order, they're all tangled up, all looking different ways, no one talking to each other. And there's a baby there neglected on the ground. If you go along the snake's body a little further, let's go back. No, just next to that, you'll see another one where there are groups of what should be forms of a human being, coherent, but in fact it's broken into pieces. So 2 people are sitting there, not looking at each other and feeling very broken, fragmented. You go back a bit further and you'll see a cross and a kind of rectangle. That's a representation of a grave, people sitting at the grave, death. You go back along a little further and you'll see once again, there are a representation of people sitting together, but one of them in particular is broken. And if you go directly underneath that particular one, you'll see another representation of the broken, people gathered in broken form. And there is a full one, as it should be in Japaljarri's mind, people gathered, firmly concentrating, sitting quietly, coherently together. That form, he calls out, that form we have to restore. A taxon linking is a phrase well known to many of you. That night in Yuendamu, 2019, if I recall, to which Pamela speaks and Melinda will speak in her submission, is another example of the attacks on linking, of the disintegration of the eunomia, of the failure to consult properly, of another form of this strange disintegration which is penetrating our country, and which perhaps you as therapists will understand that the effect or the traumatic disintegration that follows from such attacks on linking, plus the poison, plus the bite. It is a simple return. Having come this far and giving you a run through parallel process, think of where were you when you first heard Indigenous voices in whatever way, and perhaps try to follow through, as it were a dream, if you like, the linkings between yourself or your family and Indigenous people or voices and the country, and see to what extent you can bring any of that experiences into this capacity to feel, observe, to enter into the, let's call it, the therapeutic task facing us in the country this year and into the future. I'm thinking of the term diagnosis. This is where I've been bringing myself to a close. You look at the situations that have brought us to this particular condition, and you think the versions of the snake bite, using Japaljarri's concept of the poison that's penetrated, and his version of the breakup of the connections. You look at that and you think, well, as a metaphor that works, but in detail, how would we look at the case history of ourselves? How would we consider the perpetuating circumstances, the precipitating circumstances, the preventative actions, and the prognosis? For us as a group of therapists, psychoanalysts, doctors, and whatever, how would we gather ourselves together in eunomia, in good order, and do what we can? Not necessarily about the political situation, but somehow or other, carrying through the promise and the collaboration between black and white. May the serpent turn back and its coils be utterly broken. May the serpent's coils be shivered in pieces. May the backbone of the serpent sink to the ground and be smashed to pieces. Well, okay. But my heart goes to eunomia, to the principle of good order. And my gratitude goes to that simple welcome by Mrs. Elizabeth Goolagong to a slightly lost 4-year-old white boy stepping up onto her veranda for the very first time. Thank
you. Well, thank you very much, Craig. That was you acted in a way as a sort of a cultural interpreter for us. You know, there's so much richness in that, but there's so much that's challenging. But I think it was very sensitively rendered and very moving, really. And the artwork is very evocative and speaks to the commonality for us as psychotherapists and Indigenous, you know, for the utility of the symbolic as well. Yeah. So we're going to have some time now for discussion. So
Please do.
Do you want to sit here, or how would you like to?
I'll come over in a minute. I just wanted to check if if Ken, given that I'm referring to quite a lot of your family members, if there's any comment that you'd like to make.
Yep, okay, yep.
Where are you going to do that from?
So we're going to sit up there?
If he says so,
Okay.
I'm going to bring my cigar.
You can select turn like
Okay. Yep, all good?
So, yes, go ahead.
All right, so what was highlighted today is pretty much the reflection of how we see the world, and also how we see the opportunities that actually presents itself, for us today as well in regards to going forward. In our society, we don't exclude people. We include people into our processes. And that's how we can understand that we can then truly have this sort of dual responsibility and dual sort of kind of direction for ourselves. So that's the kind of like the nature of it all. So, and these sort of kind of symbols represent that, like if we actually sit down and work things out and play our roles, we can actually get there. And I'd like to sort of use a quote from a friend of mine that's back in Alice. She said, look, don't tell me the sky's the limit when we know that men actually walked on the moon. Incredible. That's what we can achieve when we come together. We can too walk on the moon. Yeah, questions?
Well, there may be questions from the audience. We've got about half an hour just to have discussion about the paper. And if you'd like to stay with us, Ken, that'd be terrific.
Yes.
And Melinda, if you'd like to enter in to the discussion at any point, let us know. So Anthony Corner's got a question or a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And Ken, look, you were very careful, Craig, to highlight that you were speaking and referring to the indigenous nations of Central Australia. Ken, you've just referred to a kind of dual story.
Yeah.
It is my understanding that there's a lot in common in terms of what in English we refer to as the dreaming across Australian nations. But I wonder if you both might like to comment on to what extent we can see a kind of, some elements of unity across the different indigenous nations.
Okay. Now, when we sort of look at the, I suppose the word, the dreaming or the dream time, it's not the rapid eye movement. It's actually the consciousness in regards to how we sort of begin to understand our world around us. Now, we have two forms of language. One is the ceremony language that crisscrossed all over this country, which is the song lines. And that sort of kind of song lines is only referred to during ceremony times. It's just like when we go to church, certain words are only uttered in certain times in church only, not outside. So it's like the Latin language, and from Latin language, all these dialects come from. That's our sort of kind of system. So one sort of long language first that crisscrosses all the nations as song lines. Then we have our own little tribal boundary language groups. So that allowed us to actually refer to the I suppose to the Latin language that allowed us to move across and travel across to other areas as a safe passage traveling through. And it was recognized throughout this country. We still do pilgrimage around in the territory We still do the traveling around where the journey goes from different tribal groups to the destination where that songline ends, and then people return. So that still is sort of kind of followed as part of our ritual every season.
You want to comment? No. Any other questions? Are you happy with that?
Oh, look, yeah, that is helpful actually, because, certainly as we go through this journey this year towards hopefully a voice, but, Indigenous peoples coming together and, speaking with some degree of unity. One of the stumbling blocks to that, I think, in some people's minds anyway, has been that it is all this diversity, and how do we achieve the unity? But I think you have addressed it to my mind anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, because we all sort of work to that one form. It's just two language technically, our tribal languages, but then this sort of kind of songline, which is like the Latin language that, we can only sort of use that during ceremony time. It's just like you can only use language in Parliament to a particular time as well, not every day. So we do have that opportunity to exercise, dual heritage, dual responsibility towards each other to be able to shape our future. I think we can do that. After all, men did walk on the moon.
I want to pick something up.
Yeah.
I'm going to probably get into trouble here. In Spencer's picture, you get that quite clear definition of the fragmentation, distinct from following Kira Kungulu's system. That is the reciprocity and the acknowledgement. What am I doing wrong? Okay. So as we're diagnosing, if I can use that term, it's where the reciprocity, the accountability system has broken down that you get the emergence of the big dick men and whatever the equivalent for the women is, who are only in there to get their own bellies full. And part of the system referred to by Susie with Jungla Rice is where there's the opportunity for the big dick men to be put back into their place. But there's too many men out there with the big dicks. I'm quoting an Aboriginal woman, right, about this, big belly, big dick. Only in it for themselves. And there are men and women who are only in it for themselves or following a particular political nudge. And this is the problem. This is the diagnosis. So it's not really only just like your problem. It's all of our problem because of this fragmenting. And I'm going to tell you something else. Why did I tell you about Jungla Rice? Who is Jungla Rice's granddaughter? Nampijinpa Price. And I'm not going to go into Nampijinpa Price's background, but something has happened there in which she's been seized. And if I think about her grandmother and her grandfather and her mother, what happened?
Jeremy, I think there's a question just here. If you just raise your hand. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you all. It's Gabriel Filer here. I wanted to just...
Could you just say who you are, where you're from?
I'm Gabriel Filer, psychoanalytic psychotherapist and psychiatrist in Melbourne. I wanted to open up the idea of how do we get to the moon and the therapeutic task. And I was thinking about the task ahead politically, nationally, around the voice, and how can we non-destructively and creatively come together, and in history to be able to do that with what's being proposed is an incredibly challenging task. So I'm wondering how the panel's thoughts on that.
Yep. Well, in a sort of kind of, I suppose this is where I use the word WWKISS, right? Western World Ideology, Ideology, Society and Structure. We also have ours, but it all comes down to people. People sort of appoint Parliament, right? So people actually said, okay, you're going to be here, but you're only good as us sort of putting you there, but to do a job. And that job is to actually, make it better for us all, not for the selective. So that's the system. So the same with when we have Kita and Kurungu. The Kita is the owner, but the Kurungu actually works and does all the work for everyone. And then we on the other side, on our mother's side, so it's we have the patrilineal and the matrilineal side. On the matrilineal side, I'm the peasant. I work for my uncle and his kids. But on the patrilineal side, my auntie's kids work for me. So we have that role. So in understanding I suppose, the king and the peasant role, and we all have them, so we're not sort of kind of obsessed with power. We share that equally in making decisions. And then we can also share a dream together to about where do we want to go? Do we want to go to the moon? Well, let's do it. And how do we do it? Well, let's work on it. Starts by talking. Starts by having a dream as well. So hopefully that's answered your question.
And Craig, did you want to comment on this?
I like it.
Yeah, come up here then.
You can see everybody.
Yeah.
That question is so absolutely, totally necessary, but it's going to take us a couple of days to work that out, all right? Response. But what we're trying to get to, I think, in this, from a psychoanalytic point of view, is to move as deeply as we can into the unconscious cultural pressures that are working through the country. And these can't always, in my opinion, can't always be solved by the political intervention. What Kenny's doing here is referring us back to the substructure of indigenous accountability and responsibility, and to go back to understand the substructure. Now, it so turns out that because I'm included through kinship system now into the Jungarai Japaljarri Nampijinpa Jungala Kurungulu Kira Kurungulu system, I can't do very much in my negotiations with serious matters in Indigenous culture unless the Jungala, the Jampijinpa and the Jungarai Japaljarri group, plus the women, the Mothers Association, can say to me, actually, no, Craig, you can't do that, or yes, you go and do that. I'm bound into a system as far as possible. So's he. But then the Japanankas and his mob, his father's Japananka and Japanadi, they're bound into a system too with me. Why can't we go back to understand a bit more carefully the substructure of the Indigenous relationship with the country, and then hold those people who are the big belly, big dicks to account for their own system, to their own system? But that needs careful Indigenous negotiators. I can't do that. But I'm repeating this, but I must say it. It looks like the toxicity is emerging because of the failure to make this accountability process going in a deep cultural way. Maybe we won't get to it. Maybe we will. But we've got to be reminded of the Kira Kurungulu system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's right.
Other questions?
And like I also said, we're not exclusive. We actually include people through the process that it allows us to sort of see it together. So there's no misunderstanding.
If you just say who you are, where you're from.
Oh, hello. Hi, my name's Alan Tegg. I'm a psychotherapist in Sydney. Thanks, Craig. What a fantastic paper. And of all the things you've said, the thing that's ringing with me, just the elder who said that God sent the Baptist priest to Yuendamu, I think you said, or to learn Warlpiri, you know.
Yes.
And of all the things you said, that's what sort of stuck with me. And the reason why is as you know, I spent a lot of time in Indigenous Australia in my 20s, and I've been trying to work out how I was seen by the people, how they made sense of me and what they wanted me to be. And when you said that, I sort of thought, God, I went there. I was actually employed as a community advisor. So I went there to do my job, to help. But I started to wonder when you said that, whether they saw me as coming because I needed to learn. That there was something in me, like God needed to learn Warlpiri, that I needed to learn something, because once you said that, it made sense of a lot of the way that people sort of related to me and talked to me. So,
sure. And isn't that one of the basic tenets of some psychoanalytic practice? That you do not go into the consulting room with a patient with the assumption that you know all, but in fact, each session you were there again to learn.
Yeah,
I think that's one of our ethics, you see. But this is this ontology thing. See, Larry Jungarai, as I understood him, was saying not only did that Ngangkari, the Jungarai Ngangkari, make everything, he is it himself. Not he made me. I thought he was going to say, oh, he made me. No, he said, I am that. That's a very interesting ontological shift of identity. So if someone like me goes into Warlpiri country and joins up with Jungarai, in the end, I am that.
yes.
So what's happened is Jungarai has recruited more human beings to help look after him and pay for him and drive his vehicle and get petrol and so forth, but at the same time become incorporated into the Jukurrpa being. It's a complete reversal of the way most Christians think about missionary systems. So that's worth a whole day's discussion.
Yeah.
So you want me to have a
Yes,
little?
if you want to.
Hey, look, it's just like, you know, we are the product of all of this, see? Like, we come from somewhere, supernatural being was responsible in creating us. And at the same time, it gave us these signs that we see all the time, right? And, you know, and this is not rocket science. We have one sun, one moon, one star system, one whole landmass. We're just separated by water from other cultures. So there's someone bigger than us out there that created us, and it all is equal, and we're all products of that. That's all we are.
Thank you. I just wanted to also make people aware there's quite a number of people online listening,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if anybody who's joining us online would like to make a comment or put a comment in the chat box. I'm just inviting you to do that. In the meantime, are there any other questions from our audience here?
How's our time, please?
We've got about 10 minutes, well, about 9 minutes.
Okay.
According to my watch. Yes.
And I'll just say to our online participants, if you could just use the raise hand function, that's clicking reactions and then raise hand, I'll know that you're wanting to contribute. Thanks.
Thanks.
Craig and Kenny, just a quick question, maybe you could comment on.
Could
Craig
you
over here.
just announce who you are? And
Yeah, Matt McArdle from Melbourne.
Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Look, you've mentioned diagnosis a couple of times and just keeps occurring to me. If we don't recognise as a disease, we don't think there's a need for treatment or cure. And I just all the thoughts about the voice, but also the broader issues of what needs treatment. It seems to me that there's a whole cohort of our society that don't recognise the disease or the extent of it. And I just wondered what your thoughts about that were and how we could make the diagnosis seen.
Well, there's several thoughts on that. One is in the list of categories for diagnosis, you go to the distress in the law and the practices of the courts in relation to Indigenous youth and Indigenous incarceration and intoxication and violence. And that is something that my daughter behind you could address from the legal point of view, as she has, and which is being addressed through the work of Cassie at a different level. So you go through the list. Dysfunction or complications or difficulties in the law. Dysfunction and complications in the management of Centrelink and the various territory families and the various institutional systems, and go on down to become more and more personal to family violence between man, woman, child, and so on. So generally speaking, the diagnostic process, in my opinion, does not really seriously attend to the institutional frameworks within which most of us live our life and in which Indigenous people live their lives. So it's actually a massive job of making more conscious what it is that has to be brought into the diagnostic process of the social and cultural disorder. Is that all right for a start?
And this is where it's like starts. If we could write good laws that's inclusive, we can actually have cures in there as well and learn to explain the law. Because in our society, we've got to explain the laws through a process so our members can understand it to be able to follow the law. Otherwise, in the Western context, it's just launched and there's no other really explanation. It's just like, thank you, please, and excuse me. How do we really teach that? We say to our kids, what do you say? What's the magic word? And yet we don't teach the importance of what's behind thank you, please, excuse me, and pardon me. It's that basic, really. We've got to teach it. So if we're going to write good laws, then we've got to teach the good laws to be able to sort of live it. So it's a responsibility of the lawmakers to be able to teach it, not just write laws for the sake of it. Then we can start healing ourselves.
That's good. And I'm acknowledging Melinda in this too, because a lot of her work, Melinda Hinkson will speak later, but maybe not, has been this kind of process of attempting to diagnose the relational system, the relational patterns, to bring out what's actually happening in our relational, say in the Yundum area or others. Melinda, would you like to say anything about that now? This will help set things going.
Thank you, everybody. I might just add one additional concept into the mix, which is alive in everything that's been spoken about at the moment. But I'm here as a social anthropologist rather than a psychoanalyst, so I start from a slightly different place, I guess. And the one point that I would just add, I guess, in terms of this fragmentation and the sense of good order that, Craig has given us a very powerful sense of in this paper, is that what the good order does and what the Jukurrpa does and what the Kira and the Kurangulu reciprocal relationships do is they hold together people-place relationships. So that question of what country is and of the way the integrity of the person and related persons hold together a sense of who they are in the world is absolutely and utterly tied to this sense of people's ownership of place. Now, in terms of Central Australia, we're talking about many communities of people who are obviously very violently dispossessed of their country in the first colonial push, and then in many instances were granted their land back under the land rights law. Very, very powerful law, the most compelling law in the country, Northern Territory land rights law. No other land rights or native title law comes near the power of that Northern Territory land rights law vested from the Commonwealth into local traditional owners. But what we see now is, even with those laws in place, that this idea of a good order and of these cultured relationships that hold people in their place and allow people to hold their country are being very decisively undercut. So I would say that the fragmentation is absolutely and utterly a psychic fragmentation, but it has politics at its heart. It has colonial dispossession at its heart, and it has an individualist culture at its heart. And so this is where I'm not going to repeat the language that Craig used, because I'm standing here as a polite person. But yeah, I agree with everything that has been said about what the fragmentation of a good ordered system lets loose. So what I'm leaving you with is this idea that an individualist society finds the good order that's being spoken about here as an absolute attack, as a threat to its own justification, its own legitimacy. And that is why the situation in Central Australia is so dire at the moment. It's why the good order has such power and such importance.
Yeah.
Well, we're probably going to have to start to bring things to a close. According to my watch, it's almost 11:45, but I notice this clock says something different, 10:45 rather. I was just really wanting to sort of finish by thanking everyone, but ahead of that, just to say there's something so exciting about what you've all presented, that if this voice can be given a place, everybody's got so much to gain from it. I mean, some of the things that have been said about governance and so on, our country needs this help. There are so many exciting things that benefits we could all derive from it. I really want to thank Craig, first and foremost, for giving us a feast of ideas and translating concepts and conveying things in such a powerful way. And also then to Ken for elaborating and helping us to digest the feast a bit more in the way that you did, which is really very helpful. To all of you with your questions and comments, and Melinda's final elaboration for us, which I think will carry with us through in the next session. So I'd invite you all to thank our presenters. So there'll be some important flowers in our next segment, but now we've got half an hour for morning tea. Thank you.